I read someone like David Smith in The Guardian, who on Saturday wrote an essay saying that the US was leaning towards autocracy and that he was very concerned for the slippages of democracy.
What happens in a democratic election is that the other side sometimes wins and sometimes gets to implement its policies. And we have members of the Democratic Party and the media who are often one and the same, who seem to believe that whenever their side loses an election, that means it's the end of democracy, that it's autocracy.
With a chainsaw, Joel. Isn't
No,
there
it needs
a greater
doesn't need a
kindness
chainsaw.
and process to
There's-
do that?
If you work in the private sector, there's no kindness, there's no process. In a failing company, there are just layoffs. That's it. You arrive at work on Monday and they tell you, we're losing money, we're cutting 25% of the workforce, pack your bags, you have 15 minutes to go.
The ICJ case was funded by South Africa.
If you have money for the ICJ case, you certainly have money for HIV treatment in South Africa. And I think
I
that you've
agree
chosen
with you. We
you've
have to
chosen
choose
priorities.
self-sufficiency. I spent the weekend reading your book on President Trump's first 100 days. I was gobsmacked that you wrote it in 12 days, but I thought with some hindsight, now that it's out and now that the presidency is about 60 days in, how do you think things are going?
I think things are going very well, and it is interesting the degree to which the president has followed the suggestions in my book. Just yesterday, this would be Tuesday, March 25th, he signed an executive order, for example, on election integrity. And I have some suggestions about that in my book, and he followed many of those suggestions. The only surprising thing to me has been the speed at which he has moved. He's actually moved through the list of suggestions very, very quickly. And it almost could have been done in the first week because he has been absolutely on point and very rapid with his executive orders and his actions. This may be the fastest start to any presidency, certainly since Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who really established the standard of the first 100 days as a measurement of a presidency, but perhaps even faster than FDR.
So I saw that in the book you lay out that it was FDR who came up with the idea of 100 days, which is very much copied around the world as the first benchmark by which to judge the effectiveness of an administration or executive or head of state. And it's true when I go through your book, many of those points have been made. Which documents did you use to draw up the book, or is it really just insider knowledge and you had a pretty good sense of where this president wanted to go?
Well, let me take a step back and talk about the spirit in which the book was written. So the idea for the book came about in late May last year when the president was facing charges in Manhattan, in New York. He was accused of falsifying business records because he allegedly didn't report expenses on an agreement with former adult film star Stormy Daniels as campaign expenses. They were personal expenses, and the prosecutor said they should have been reported as campaign expenses. Now, local prosecutors don't actually have the authority to prosecute federal campaign violations, and the federal campaign authority had not found any violation, nor had the federal prosecutors in New York. So this was entirely an invention of the local prosecutor in New York, and therefore it was seen, and I believe it was, illegitimate. And it was crazy to watch this trial unfold, where the president was facing these criminal charges that could theoretically see him put in prison for hundreds of years if you added up all the felonies. And I was watching this, as many other Americans did, with a real sense of concern about where our country was heading. This is the sort of thing that's done in banana republics. It was treated very seriously by much of the media, but most thinking people understood what was going on here, which was that the legal system was being abused by a partisan and politically motivated prosecutor. So when he was ultimately convicted, I thought about what my response ought to be. And I'm actually not very good at being angry for very long. So I decided to write something positive, and I thought ahead to what it would look and feel like when President Trump took office in January 2025. And immediately I realized he would face the same kind of opposition that he had faced 8 years before, where Democrats tried to prevent him from governing. So I realized he couldn't really count on the legislative process in Congress, where the minority party does have a significant amount of control. It can block certain kinds of legislation. It can block appointments. So I thought, what can he do as president, acting within his executive authority under the Constitution? What are the things he can do? So I didn't substitute my own policies for his. I just included those that I thought he would do.
So, I mean, as I read through it, I thought, wow, this book came out before, and each of these things, many of them are being implemented, as you say. So I can see from your perspective how you feel that things are going well and in the direction that you had hoped and perhaps influenced. From my perspective, where I sit and look at it, and I read someone like David Smith in The Guardian, who on Saturday wrote an essay saying that the US was leaning towards autocracy and that he was very concerned for the slippages of democracy. I must say, I come down quite close to David Smith's view. When I look at what's happening in the US, at the universities, all the cases going to court, at some of the executive orders, it's with a sense of genuine chill and with genuine fright looking at this country.
Well, let me reassure you, because what happens in a democratic election is that the other side sometimes wins and sometimes gets to implement its policies. And we have members of the Democratic Party and the media who are often one and the same, who seem to believe that whenever their side loses an election, that means it's the end of democracy, that it's autocracy if Republicans win, if conservative politicians implement their policies. And it's really curious what Democrats have done over the two Trump presidencies. They've run both times on the idea that a Trump victory would be the death of democracy, the arrival of autocracy, and they try to scare voters with these warnings. And then having made these warnings, they almost feel foolish when they don't see reality turning out that way, but they have to live within the nightmare that they've created. So they have to interpret everything through their lens. Otherwise, they think they look silly or unable to predict outcomes. And so they have this narrative that they have to stick with, and they're stuck in it, even though what Trump is doing with the executive orders is often simply reflecting the preferences of the vast majority of Americans, and preferences that are often ignored by Washington because of reasons of political correctness. I mean, for example, transgender men in female sports. Now, there's an effort, there has been an effort over the last several years to label you as a bigot if you oppose biological males participating in girls' sports. But it happens to be a position with which 75% of the American public agree with the president. The president says we are not going to allow biological men to compete against biological women because of the dangers that it poses, because it's unfair to competition. It distorts the career paths of female athletes and so forth. And the sort of chattering classes, if you will, in Washington and New York think that that's the ultimate bigotry, but it's actually what female athletes want, and it's supported by 3/4 of Americans. So I think this talk about democracy fading is in many ways the lament of an elite that failed to hold on to power because we don't actually live in an autocracy. We live in a democracy, which means sometimes you have to take turns.
I get that. But if I'm to bring it to South Africa, your other country, our constitution was written against what would have been the majority view on many things. So that would be freedom of choice. That would be the death penalty. That
What does freedom of choice mean?
So freedom of choice in the way in which I'm using it is the right to abortion for women, the right to bodily integrity and the right of reproductive rights. So many values and rights written into our constitution didn't ascribe to what the majority was. Isn't that how you construct good societies? Is that you have to sometimes create visions and rights and systems that go against what the majority might want because you're trying to create something better.
No, that's absolutely true. And South Africa is my native country, not my other country.
Yeah.
But South Africa does that in its constitution, and the United States does that in its constitution. And the most important minority that's protected is the minority of one, the individual liberties. And you're absolutely right that a constitutional democracy does constrain the power of the majority, what Alexis de Tocqueville called sometimes the tyranny of the majority. You have to have protections. But when it comes to things like freedom of choice for abortion, remember also that there are other rights at stake. There are the rights of the mother, but there are also the rights of the unborn child. And those are debates that Americans like people all over the world, struggle with because it's not clear which of those rights ought to prevail. We tried for a long time to say, well, it depends when in a pregnancy, that perhaps the mother's rights prevail earlier on in a pregnancy, perhaps the child's rights prevail later on. But what Trump has done is said, we decide this at the level of the states. So we also have federalism because there are some questions that are best decided by the level of government closest to the people.
You know, the thing I've learned in reading about the US is, and I don't know, obviously I have nowhere near your level of knowledge. I have always found it to be a society that lives by the rule of law. And if there's something that I have been aghast at watching is the kind of chainsaw massacre of the federal level of the state, USAID, many government departments, many fabulous places like the National Institutes of Health, which have domino effects in how they spread American knowledge and not largesse, but aid and also goodwill. And they've just gone to the wall. I mean, what have you thought about that kind of politics as it would ascribe to people who've written on American society and civil society like de Tocqueville?
So let's talk about the overall problem that we
Mm.
have with government spending in the United States. We have deficits that are far too large. We've built up a very large national debt. And it's because the politicians on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, have lacked the political will to cut spending. There's a huge amount of bureaucracy that doesn't actually do anything or that repeats functions other governments already perform. And the only way to do it is in this drastic fashion. You know, when you look at how the corporate world
With a
works or the business
chainsaw,
world,
though, with a chainsaw, Joel.
no,
Isn't
no,
there a
it
greater
doesn't need a
kindness
chainsaw.
and process to
There's,
do that?
you know, if you work in the private sector, there's no kindness, there's no process. In a failing company, there are just layoffs. That's it. You arrive at work on Monday and they tell you, we're losing money. We're cutting 25% of the workforce. Pack your bags. You have 15 minutes to go. And
Not here,
please
but us,
hand in your
eh?
ID.
Doesn't
Well,
work here.
that's how it works in a growing economy. You have to be able to fire people if you want to be able to hire people. And people accept that. In a dynamic private sector, you understand that your job is not permanent and that if your company fails, you may be required to leave and find a new job. And it works that way throughout the private sector. It doesn't work that way in the public sector here. And until now, when Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, have gone around and said, we're identifying all these areas for cuts. This money is spent poorly or inefficiently, and we need to get rid of it. Now, there is the risk when you do that sometimes you cut things that are working or that are necessary. But the idea is you can build those things back fairly easily. What we cannot tolerate any longer is this incredibly vast amount of spending. So it is actually part of a response to a crisis in the economy in general that came about under the last administration, the Biden administration, which accelerated spending even more. And it's necessary. In fact, the chainsaw is actually insufficient. You need something much more powerful. I mean, you need an army of chainsaws. You need a lawnmower. You need something that's really going
No,
to
that's
cut through.
terrible.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the
No, that's
National Institutes of
terrible.
Health. No,
Yes.
it's absolutely necessary because you have to restore confidence in the public fiscus. You have to restore confidence in the ability of the government to balance the budget. National Institutes of Health. There is some great work done by the National Institutes of Health. There's also some terrible things that are being done. And public confidence in the NIH was shattered under COVID. In fact, public confidence in many of these agencies was shattered under COVID. We're now told by the New York Times that it may have been a lab leak after all in China that led to the escape of the coronavirus and the global spread. If you said that 4 or 5 years ago, you could be kicked off social media, and you were told by people like Dr. Anthony Fauci and others that you were a menace to society, but it actually happened to be the truth. And people discovered, again, to their horror, that the National Institutes of Health had been funding some of this research in China and other places. You know, as we go into USAID funding, what we have discovered is that a lot of the funding was going toward interest groups that were aligned politically with one side and that saw their primary function as political, actually, and not really as performing any kind of service for anybody in the United States or abroad. So there was a kind of corruption that was ingrained in the system very deeply, where Democrats would become part of these executive agencies, would then send money to their own interest groups outside of government, and then sometimes return to those groups and work there, or use those interest groups to make sure that Democrats were reelected. And Elon Musk and Doge have now disrupted that, and it's a great public service to the United States. And there may be some worthy causes that have suffered a loss of funding as a result, but this is just not something that's sustainable. We can't afford it, and it does corrode faith in our democracy, both because politicians have no other way to cut funding except for this, and because we've become aware of the extent to which some of the funding was used to promote a political agenda from within government.
I must say, just to share with you before I go on to the next question, is some of the USAID people from here, for example, who had to pack up their lives in a couple of weeks and go back, they were doing really great work. HIV, TB extension workers, they were running libraries, the kind of salt of the earth people. And I think it's not for nothing that Teslas are under such protest, because I don't think that what Elon Musk is doing is with the spirit that I've always understood America, but maybe I completely misunderstood it. But I do want to move on to our
Well, let me
next
ask you a question
area
about that.
now.
Let me ask you something
sure.
about that.
Yes.
Why does America have to fund that? Why doesn't South Africa fund some of those
That's
very worthy
that's
programs?
that's a perfectly fair question to ask of a middle income country, but the extension of people to good people
Wait a minute,
people solidarity
you're
is
spending in the
very, very
DRC.
important.
You have spending. You have enough money to spend on sending troops to the DRC. You have enough money to spend on the Gautrain and other public works projects that are very fancy, perhaps, but they don't really seem to benefit ordinary people. Maybe they do. I don't know. But I mean, you have money. The money is not the issue. Why does
So
South
I'm
Africa not spend the money?
I'm acknowledging your point that we're going to have to find that money now and find it quickly and stop wasting money. But those things were extended by people to people solidarity and in a spirit which lifted many people suffering from AIDS and who had been infected by HIV in ways that I think will only tally over decades. But can I move to the next one, though, can you share with us, because we really don't know, who's Leo Brent Bozell III, and what do you think of his nomination as a possible ambassador to South Africa from the US?
First of all, I wish him well. Brent Bozell is the leader of something called the Media Research Center here in the United States. He's been a media critic and commentator for a long time on Fox News and on other conservative networks. And he is responsible for an organization called Newsbusters, which is a conservative news watchdog that points out left-wing bias in mainstream American media. So he is a frequent media critic, and he is apparently the nominee for ambassador to South Africa. Now, Ferial, when there was talk of my possibly being a nominee, hold on.
We're in for hell, yeah, are we?
Yeah. I mean, when there was talk that I might be the ambassador, Ferial, you wondered on social media whether there was some way of keeping me out of the country. So now you get what you wished for. Now you get someone who, in many ways, might be more strident than I am in his conservatism. So good luck with that.
I'm sure he wasn't going to sit down for an interview with me. How far did you get in the interview process, Joel? And how do you feel that you're not going to be ambassador here?
Well, there wasn't much of a process, and I've been saying the same thing to everybody, which is that all I was told was that I was on a very, very short list. That's the exact quote that I was told from people in the White House, and people in the White House reached out to me, and there were discussions, but ultimately it's up to the president. There isn't really a process, especially because Democrats right now are blocking State Department appointees from being confirmed by the Senate. So there's no State Department to handle this. This is all concentrated in the presidency. It's sort of ironic that Democrats are blocking the State Department to protest against Trump, but what they get in the end is more Trump control over foreign policy. But it's up to the president. The president has the authority, and he's going to send who he wants. And I don't really know what happened. I do note that the South African government made it very clear and very public that they didn't want me coming. So perhaps the Trump administration decided that was a fight best not worth having and that they would start fresh. But as I said before, I consider myself fairly conservative. He may be much more conservative than I am. And so the South African government, as I said also last week, before I knew anything about how this was going to shake out, whether it's me or somebody else, you're getting Trump's ambassador. Whoever is appointed is going to follow Trump's policies. So it's not as if there's an alternative to my views, even though I'm somewhat critical of Trump sometimes when I want to be. But you're getting Trump's ambassador, you're getting Trump's policies, and that's what we have to deal with.
What does this mean? I was looking at the Mr. Bazell's the third's posts, and wow, this is megaphone diplomacy. What do you think's happening with diplomacy in these times? What are these new rules of engagement and disengagement? So I keep something now called a Trump tracker because it was overwhelming what is happening. And this was just in South Africa. And we're running at about 13 posts and at least a couple of executive orders. Is this the way relationships are managed now?
I think the way to manage the relationship with Trump is to offer Trump compromises. And you can decide what those compromises will be. But I think that's how he wants to engage with countries with whom the United States has disagreements. He wants to resolve those disagreements. He wants to get to better places in relationships with those countries. But he wants those countries to approach him in a spirit of compromise. Instead of which, South Africa has approached Trump with a spirit of rejection in some ways, and they've decided that he is spreading misinformation and that the appropriate role of South African ambassadors and delegates and so forth is to convince the Trump administration that it has been misinformed. The term misinformation is really quite a volatile one in the United States because, of course, Trump was excluded from social media. Others were as well for allegedly spreading misinformation. That was under the Biden administration, which colluded with private social media companies essentially to destroy free speech. And that has all been unwound now. But the idea of misinformation is very highly contested in the United States. Basically, when you use that term, what people hear is that you're trying to censor somebody else's speech. The facts that you bring to an argument might be different than the facts someone else chooses to bring to make their argument, and people will dispute what the facts actually are, and that dispute should take place in the public domain, but it shouldn't be subject to censorship and exclusion. So when Trump was accused of misinformation for some of his comments on South Africa by the South African government, that really, I think, exacerbated a rift. And the subsequent actions of the South African government also did so. So I think the South African government needs to understand it doesn't matter who you send to Washington. It's not about the person. It really is about the policies. And Donald Trump wants to reset the relationship with South Africa. There's a great deal of potential there. I mean, there could be incredible improvements in trade relations and so forth. But South Africa has to decide that it stands with the democratic West. It has to decide that it's going to protect the property rights of investors. And it has to decide that it's going to protect minority rights in South Africa because, like it or not, minority groups such as Afrikaners in South Africa have an audience in the United States that understands that they are under significant cultural pressure and other kinds of pressure. And people in the United States want to be reassured that those minority rights are protected.
When I saw that you had lunch with Cully Creel and Mr. Kleinans, whose name I've just forgotten quickly, did they have influence on those trips? Because my colleague Rebecca Davis did a very good piece of reporting, and it suggested that they didn't have any really big meetings, but obviously their message is landing somewhere. And I just want to delve one issue with you. I mean,
Wait
it's
a minute,
not.
hold on. I'll let you let me answer the first question.
Yes.
So I'm not going to comment on your colleagues' reporting, good or bad, but the fact is they did make a very good impression at the White House. So I don't know who her sources are who said they didn't meet with anybody, but what I was hearing from the White House was that they had made a very good impression. And they came out to visit me in California, and they actually visited my home, which is inside the fire zone in Los Angeles. You may have heard of the recent wildfires.
Yes, of course.
And I showed them what we were doing to try to rebuild the community. And I wasn't going to share anything about social media, or share anything about the visit on social media. It was really nobody's business. But when the Hawks announced in the South African media that they were investigating these individuals for treason, I then said, okay, I'm going to put this on social media. Why? Because they told me that they were taking the investigation seriously enough that they had prepared legal defenses, that they didn't know whether they'd be arrested at the airport when they returned to South Africa. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to put this online and document the fact that I'm meeting with them here, that people in the United States know that they're here, so that the South African government doesn't abuse its powers and arrest these gentlemen for doing nothing more than speaking their minds and exercising their freedom of speech. And yes, they are dissidents in a sense. They dissent from the prevailing view of the government, but the South African government itself once occupied that position. It went overseas, the liberation movement did, and tried to make its case. And the South African government often hosts dissidents from a variety of countries who make their case in South Africa. That's what happens. It doesn't mean that the home countries like it very much or the governments agree with it, but that's what you have to accept in a free society. So I posted that photograph because I was concerned from what they were telling me that they were actually in some significant legal jeopardy. I don't think they had done anything wrong, but they were in legal jeopardy upon arrival in South Africa. So if that photograph helped deter some of whatever was planned for them, I'm glad to have posted it. Go ahead, though. Yeah.
I don't think anything was planned for them. And for as long as they're in existence, they have enjoyed freedom of association and freedom of speech, all of which is their guarantee under the Constitution. If they get critiqued, it doesn't mean that their lives are under threat.
Well,
or
with
that
respect, going to the police and lodging a treason complaint is not critique. I mean, that's
back and be put in jail. Not at all. Not at all.
Well, why did the police make a special announcement? I mean, do they do that for everybody who goes overseas and has a visit with
I have to go
foreign
look
leaders?
properly, but I think that the general was making it at a press conference. I do think that was overstated if you thought they were going to land back and be arrested.
It was the subject of a special report on SABC. I mean, people watch these things. So, it's not as if it was beyond the realm of possibility.
They enjoy their rights of association and free speech. But I do want to get to AGOA before our time is up. Do you think the African Growth and Opportunities Act is imperiled? Because as a journalist, as a South African, that's a great concern. Hundreds of thousands of jobs and sectors of such enormous potential for the growth of our country. Do you think it's finished? South Africa must start making other plans to send our Nachis to different countries.
Well, please send your biltong here. But no, look, AGOA, I wouldn't say it's finished. Nothing is done until it's done, but it does require reauthorization later this year at the end of September, I think.
Yes.
And it's in trouble. It's in trouble for two reasons. First of all, this administration, the Trump administration, and the Republican Congress are skeptical of trade deals that favor other countries. They're skeptical of trade deals in which the United States gives preference to other countries and doesn't seem to get much in return. So it is going to be very closely looked at from that perspective. And also, Trump doesn't like multilateral treaties. If you look at his pattern of diplomacy, he prefers bilateral treaties. He prefers direct relationships with the countries he's dealing with. In multilateral arrangements, the other countries are able to amplify their leverage by, in a sense, ganging up against the United States. So he prefers bilateral treaties. But then there's a separate level, which is the question of whether South Africa will be able to participate in AGOA. And this actually came up during the Biden administration because of South Africa's perceived support for Russia. But certainly, according to the letter of the law...
And look where that's at now. Hey, who's Russia's bestie today? Hey?
Well, that was a concern of Democrats. I mean, Republicans were concerned about South Africa's foreign policy for other reasons, but South Africa really alienated its friends in the Democratic Party. The Democrats became obsessed with Russia, mostly for domestic political reasons, but it became an obsession for them under the first Trump administration and then into the Biden administration. And I think it's actually been a misguided obsession because I think even though Ukraine did very well in the early weeks of the war, that was the moment to sit down and have negotiations. I actually wrote that. I was very supportive of Ukraine. But about 2 or 3 weeks after the war began and Ukraine had successfully pushed the Russians back, I said, now's the time for negotiations. It's never going to get better than this. And indeed, it didn't. They've basically remained on the same front lines for many years now. But Democrats decided that Russia was the implacable enemy of the United States. And so South Africa's perceived closeness with Russia led Democrats to ask President Biden to express displeasure within the AGOA system. But the letter of the law in AGOA says that countries that violate the national security interests of the United States or the foreign policy interests of the United States cannot participate in AGOA. And I'm sorry to say that South Africa falls into that category in a variety of ways. First of all, Cyril Ramaphosa a few weeks ago signed or wrote an op-ed about the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is an institution that the United States is not part of, but under the first Trump administration, Trump sanctioned them because they began trying to investigate American soldiers for conduct in Afghanistan. And Trump said, there's no way we will ever delegate authority to an international court unless we've actually signed the treaty, and we hadn't. So we're going to actually put sanctions on the ICC and prevent them from traveling to the United States to prosecute our soldiers. That happened under the first Trump administration. Then Biden reversed those sanctions. Trump reinstated them in his second administration. And Cyril Ramaphosa promptly wrote this op-ed. It was mostly about the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but there were several paragraphs about the ICC where he actually took on President Trump directly. So we perceive the ICC as a threat to the national security interests of the United States because it prosecutes or tries to prosecute American soldiers without any jurisdiction to do so. It does the same thing with Israel. It tries to prosecute Benjamin Netanyahu and the former defense minister. It has no jurisdiction there either because the ICC, again, is not something that Israel is a party to. You have international treaties for a reason. You can choose to participate or not, but if you don't participate, the institution has no authority over you, except in a couple of very rare cases where, for example, certain crimes against humanity are prosecuted as a means or a matter of customary international law. But the other issue is the ICJ, that South Africa has taken Israel to the ICJ and accused it falsely of genocide because it responded to a truly genocidal attack on October 7th by Hamas. And that's also against the foreign policy interests of the United States. So simply in those two actions alone, South Africa has forfeited its right to participate in AGOA. I mean, the Trump administration could very easily decide the opposite of what the Biden administration did. The Biden administration looked at it very carefully and thought, okay, well, we'll let you stay. But the Trump administration could very quickly decide that South Africa doesn't benefit from AGOA, even if AGOA still exists, because South Africa has made foreign policy choices that are against the interests of the United States.
So then I think we had better make other plans for our nachos and apples and clementines, macadamia, BMs, and also Mercedes-Benz. But I do want to talk about sovereignty.
That's fine. I mean, you can also you can manufacture Mercedes in the United States just as easily. I mean, it's yes.
I've been listening to your president saying that.
Yeah.
And so it does seem we have to make another plan now, Joel, because this is about sovereignty. I've been reading that the wedge issue is that South Africa has to agree to drop the case at the ICJ. That's not going to happen. And I do want to chat with you about sovereignty. So what do you think of South Africa's right to choose its own relationships and spheres of interest and relationships of solidarity, while at the same time still maintaining a trade relationship with the US? Are those impossible binaries in this context, do you think?
First of all, South Africa absolutely has the sovereignty and the right to do whatever it wishes in global affairs. However, there is a cost. If you choose to try to stop Israel from defending itself against terrorists, then there are people who are going to disagree with that, and there may be a cost. And I think South Africa understands that now, and South Africa has decided it's willing to pay that cost. I mean, look at UCT, for example. UCT boycotted Israeli institutions. It lost 2/3 of its private funding, and it recently voted to keep the boycott in place. So UCT decided that it was worth the cost, and that's a choice that you can make. But while you have the right to make various choices in international affairs, no country has the right to be subsidized by other countries when they do so. And so, as valuable as trade might be with South Africa, and as much as the United States might want to work with South Africa, the United States is not going to sacrifice its sovereignty because of the choices South Africa has made. And I would just ask one other question. Are you certain that it's actually South African sovereignty that is at stake? Because many people look at the ICJ case and wonder whether the ANC accepted a large sum of money from the Iranian regime to fill its coffers before the election. Well, that's a perception that's out there.
I've seen that.
And
it's completely untrue. That has
How do you know?
That's been properly debunked, because actually, if you look at the Department of Justice budget, you will see that we paid for that case. That is absolutely untrue, that it was somehow funded by shadowy money seeking to influence the ICJ case. The ICJ case was funded by South Africa.
Okay, well, that's interesting. I accept that. I'll take your word for it. However, again,
yes.
If you have money for the ICJ case, you certainly have money for HIV treatment in South Africa. And I think that you've chosen.
With you. We have to choose self-sufficiency. We have to ensure our self-sufficiency. We must not waste. We must not be corrupt. But there are relationships of solidarity, longevity, and community between the American and South African people, which really seems to be shattered right now.
Can I ask you about that? One other question about that. There are also relationships of solidarity that are developing in the Middle East. Israel and the United Arab Emirates and perhaps soon the Saudis, other countries, they've moved on from the idea that Israel is somehow going to disappear if you simply attack it often enough. There are new relationships that are being built. There are thousands of Israeli families moving to Dubai and Israeli companies, and likewise, there are Arab businessmen who are moving back and forth. These relationships are building. Why does South Africa want to be left out of those relationships by being stuck with this court case that accuses Israel of genocide? If there's a peace deal that expands tomorrow, does Israel have to listen to South Africa? Why? No, it doesn't. It's going to continue developing relations with its neighbors. Then South Africa's frozen out of all that. I mean, who are your allies then in the Middle East? Who are you standing with? You're standing with Hamas. You're standing with Qatar. You're standing with Iran. Well, nobody really wants to deal with them. So, you can choose your friends. And
In a
I think,
in a
yeah,
multipolar world order, you certainly can, and I think we're seeing those things shifting, and probably this year they're going to shift that much more.
let me
But
offer one humble suggestion on
until
that
you
issue.
don't see
Yeah.
the end of the killing of Palestinian people, if you see what's happening right now, I don't think you can talk peace or you can talk about resetting that relationship until
Well,
then.
the war was started not by the killing of Palestinian people, but by the mass murder of Israelis, most of whom were civilians. And that's how we arrived at this point. But I would suggest that South Africa actually has a very powerful message that draws on its own history that it could provide, which is that at some point, no matter what resentment you may feel, it is time to suspend the armed struggle and enter a process of negotiations. And that is what the ANC did. And that is how it succeeded. It won at the negotiating table what it couldn't win on the battlefield. Somehow it's giving the opposite advice to Hamas and saying, keep fighting, even if you lose, even if people are dying, even if you're destroying any hope of building a stable society afterwards, because how do you do that? How do you create law and order in a society where you've said that murdering civilians on the other side is encouraged? I mean, the phone calls home from terrorists to their families, how proud they were to have killed Jewish civilians on these kibbutzim and so forth. I mean, look, I think South Africa has a role to play, but I think it's not doing justice to its own history, which is a history of overcoming conflict. And you overcome conflict by saying, we sometimes have to sit down with people we don't like, we have feelings about it and so forth. But the armed struggle at some point has to be suspended and there have to be talks. And if it doesn't work,
But
okay,
let's
but
just,
then
I mean,
you have to try.
yes, absolutely. But the bullets and bulldozers have to stop as well, surely. But I think,
Not if they're protecting people who were attacked first, and that's very important. There was quiet on the border on October 6th, and on October 7th was a different story, and that peace was broken by Hamas. That ceasefire was broken by Hamas.
I think that we could spend hours on this because I could also bring you information. I do think that that you need a meaningful ceasefire and that you do need an end to the destruction of Gaza. And this idea that Gazan people could somehow be shipped to Somaliland or somewhere in the Horn of Africa is surely just adding fuel to that fire.
Well, we'll see. Donald Trump wants to take over Gaza, so maybe they'll come back
I think
to the
the
Trump
Gaza in
Hotel
Las
in
Vegas,
Gaza
I'm
City or
not sure
whatever.
is working. But just some personal questions as we begin to wind up. I mean, I remember you when you were a speechwriter for Tony Leon. Obviously, I watch carefully what you say. I see that you were born here, that you came back here and spent formative years here. When I read your 100-day book, I see ideas that you may have learned here, like you're a campaigner for maternity rights. I didn't know that women in the US don't get maternity leave, like women here do, 4 months now. So I think some of these ideas, I hope, came from here. But I do wonder, when did things come so asunder between you and a country that you called home for long periods of your life?
Well, I don't think they've come asunder. I mean, I feel a great deal of warmth towards South Africa. I take an interest in South Africa. And I really love talking about South Africa because I think the themes that South Africa grapples with and has grappled with for the last several decades are really the great themes of the human experience. Talking about issues of poverty, inequality, opportunity, economic growth. How do you create a free society in a post-conflict situation? I mean, these are all great moral themes. They're very, very interesting to those of us who are either from South Africa, who have spent significant time in South Africa. There are many Americans who feel, as I do, that South Africa remains a fascinating place. I do think there's a profound sense of disappointment in how South Africa has turned out. When I visited over the last few years, particularly as I was doing research for my book about my mother-in-law, about Rhoda Kadali, it was quite stunning how far the infrastructure had crumbled in Johannesburg in particular. Cape Town looked, in fact, in many ways better than I remembered it. Cape Town had really improved in some ways, except for the electricity shortages that are part of a national problem. Johannesburg had really begun to collapse. And really, that's not necessary. It's not really the necessary price of a transition to a more just and equal society. I don't think South Africans should accept that. But it is very hard to see, and it does make one feel somewhat alienated. I mean, to take one's children, which I did in 2023, through Rosebank Mall, for example, during a blackout, when suddenly the power goes out and the diesel generators start going, and it's quite unsettling. And it's also just not necessary. I mean, we have our own problems with electricity generation in California because we've chosen a path of scarcity because we think we have to be green. And so we're turning off the fossil fuels and so forth before we really have enough alternative energy to do so. So it's not as if this is a problem unique to South Africa, but it's not clear how South Africa can dig itself out of this problem very easily because of the cumulative effect of BEE and very aggressive affirmative action on skill levels and so forth. The one thing that does make me feel alienated from South Africa, and I say this as a Jew. I'm a South African Jew. When I was born in South Africa in 1977, there were about 100,000 South African Jews. Now they're maybe closer, I think, to 40,000. The community has dwindled. To have a country with a Jewish population that still contributes significantly to its welfare, to have that country then go to the ICJ and not just accuse Israel of genocide, which is a word really coined in the wake of the Holocaust, the attempted extermination of the Jewish people, but also to quote the Jewish Bible as evidence of genocide. The South African attorney who did that misquoted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who referred to the story of Amalek. The story of Amalek appears in the Torah. It also has a reference later in the book of Samuel. But the common understanding among Jewish people is that that story is fundamentally about the moral imperative to stand up to evil. It is not an imperative to commit genocide. And that's how it was cited by a South African attorney. By the way, the same attorney, the same advocate, was also the one who defended Julius Malema and argued in a South African court that saying kill the Boer is not incitement to genocide, is not hate speech. So this particular individual had taken two diametrically opposite positions in these two cases, but never mind that part. To have one's faith used in that way and abused is a throwback to the medieval era when the Inquisition would pursue Jews on the basis of these selective readings or misinterpretations of the Jewish faith. And to watch South Africa do that was really stomach-churning. And I think the South African Jewish community has come to terms with the fact that its government is not going to be a pro-Israel government. I think they wish it would take a more productive approach. And of course, there are dissenters within the Jewish community who are very happy with the South African government's position. But to have South Africa take a kind of national pride in that sort of case that really, I think, came at a time when Jews around the world were feeling vulnerable, certainly in Israel from terrorism, but also from anti-Semitism that spread throughout the United States and Europe. I think if anything could have severed my relationship with South Africa, it was that. And I think it has severed relations between many in the South African Jewish community, not just in South Africa, but around the world, who would otherwise like to help South Africa.
So thank you for sharing that. It does help me understand things. If I can just share with you that I think where we find each other is my view that Johannesburg should be in a very different trajectory to the one you saw when you visited with your little ones. An 83 billion rand a year city should be at the pinnacle of developing a post-1994 identity as a leading African city. So what happens here occupies most of my time. I guess where I have to say to you honestly that I disagree with you. I covered that ICJ case exhaustively and made sure that I read very, very deeply. And I must say, I was proud of South Africa for taking up that case. I don't know the Amalek verse as closely as you do. I try to read, and I'll go and read some more. But I was very proud of our country for standing up for human rights in its finest tradition there. And I really don't think that South Africa is going to agree to drop that case. You know, it's probably going to continue for the next 8 years at least. But I do thank you very much for making the time to talk, and I hope it's a line of communication that we'll keep open.